Hi again, everybody. Such a pleasure to have Sean Gibbons with us today and to speak in this series. Sean, I'm super excited to hear your talk. Please take it away. Tell us about living histories.
Thanks, Sri, and thanks to you and Orit for the invitation. I'm embarrassingly honored to do this, especially considering the prior company. I still consider myself pretty early on in my scientific career. I'm just 3 years into my faculty position, so I don't really have like a big retrospective view on science or my career to give you all. But I've seen other people give talks of that kind in this forum. So I'm going to focus more on my biography, my background, and how I got to where I got, and less so on the science. Oops. So I'm from Montana, and it's a really beautiful place. This is a picture of Glacier National Park in the northwestern part of the state. Not a lot of people and a lot of nature. Probably a good place, origin for an ecologist, which is what I ultimately consider myself. So, I think a lot of my interest in science and the natural world essentially came from being surrounded by such beautiful nature throughout my childhood. Just to give you a geographic look at where Montana is on a map, it's the sort of northernmost part of the Rocky Mountains in the lower 48. It's, I think, the fourth largest state in the US, but fewer than 1 million people, or at least when I was born, it was fewer than 1 million people. So we're pretty sparsely populated. But despite this sparse population, it's pretty culturally diverse in a way. There's very distinct cultures that you can find across the state, and I sort of experienced many of them throughout my childhood. And so I'll kind of give you a little bit of a background on what was the context in which I grew up. But I guess first, I'm a white guy in North America, so obviously I'm not an indigenous person. So how did I get over here? Late 1800s or so, my dad's family came over from Ireland. They're escaping poverty essentially in the old world, and they landed in Butte, Montana, a hard rock copper mine. And so pretty much my entire family history is very blue collar. Very much manual labor, and also very union, workers of the world unite, eat the rich, have a big chip on our shoulders about management and people with any amount of wealth. So that's been an interesting chip to carry on my shoulder as I move through the ivory towers of the world. But this is kind of the background of my family. We're generally speaking we don't have a lot of money, and we're coming from kind of working class stock. My parents grew up in a small railroad town in western Montana, and when they kind of became adults, they spent their entire 20s essentially on drugs, sex, and rock and roll, I would say. They don't have careers per se. They kind of just worked whatever job was available to pay the bills, and then the rest of the time was spent on their out of work passions, which was, for my dad, writing. He is a poet, and reading and partying and what have you. And my mother is a yoga teacher in her spare time when she's not a cashier at a grocery store. And so she teaches hot yoga and a number of other kind of yogas. So this is about the time when they started having kids, though. They decided they had to clean up their act and maybe get health insurance. So my dad went back to school and got his teaching certificate to teach English, high school English. And we moved to this little cow town on the kind of frontier between the Rocky Mountain front, where the Rockies come up, and the Great Plains, where they crash into the Rockies. About 150 people or so in this town. And I spent my early childhood here. The biggest event in town was the Augusta Rodeo. So I remember going to a lot of rodeos. It's my little brother Cash here in the bottom of the photo. So my early childhood was essentially surrounded by beautiful nature, but also a bunch of cowboys and ranchers, and the kind of culture that comes along with that, you can imagine. And then my dad got a job kind of just shooting right over the Rockies, going right over the Continental Divide to the west, in a little town called Pablo, which is on the Flathead Reservation, Native American reservation. Montana's got some of the largest land area of reservations of any state. This particular reservation is home to the Salish and Kootenai tribes. So I spent, second grade to eighth grade growing up on the reservation. Instead of rodeos, it was powwows on the reservation. And so, all my classes growing up, I had a full period of Native American history, and I got a big dose of, the atrocities that we had committed against the native peoples of this continent. So started to kind of build an ethic for political engagement and getting involved in social justice kind of stuff. But as I approached high school and my dad sort of tired of teaching, he wanted to go back to school to get his master's in fine arts, to kind of take his writing more seriously and get more into being a poet, and maybe just go back to blue collar jobs so he could just kind of work, not have to think about it. And then when he gets home, he can write. I think teaching was a little too much. It sapped his energy for writing. So we moved to the big city, to Missoula, Montana. And this is sort of it's like the Austin, Texas of Montana. It's a little blue dot in a very red state, very progressive, very open-minded place. I had sort of realized that I was gay back on the reservation, but it wasn't necessarily a very permissive environment to come out, even though my family was very open to all of that. But coming to Missoula allowed me to come out finally as gay in high school. And the public schools in Missoula were great. Public schools were pretty good other places, but they weren't great. But in Missoula, the access to resources was a lot better. And so I was never that ambitious academically throughout school. My parents didn't put a lot of pressure on me to be academically ambitious or get straight A's. But towards the end of high school, I did start to take school a little more seriously. And my high schools were offering advanced placement classes in topics like biology. And so I got drawn in. But then when I started thinking about applying to colleges, I looked up MIT because it was the big name that came to mind. And there was like an $80 application fee to apply. And I was like, oh, shoot, I can't ask my parents for $80. And then every application was going to be $50 to $80. So I just totally scrapped the idea of applying to college, and I thought I wasn't going to go. But luckily, the University of Montana, or my little local university, just threw me a scholarship, which was essentially about a year's tuition. And so that was enough for me, and I signed up. So I went to the University of Montana. It was a great little school in the Rockies, good lifestyle. You have access to the beauty of Montana, and they're pretty good faculty in a lot of the different departments. My parents couldn't help me with tuition. So in the summers, I would work as a moving man. I worked for Mayflower Moving for 3-4 months out of the year, made up as much as I could and saved that. And it kind of lasted me through the rest of the year. Maybe did some odd jobs like tutoring and occasional moving jobs during the school year. And then mostly focused on academics throughout the school year. And when I hit university, I kind of went hog wild with academics. I was all in. And I just took every class I could take. I think I took I don't know what fraction of the courses I took that you could take at University of Montana, but I took a significant fraction of those, from ballet to anthropology, political science, philosophy, physics, chemistry. I ended up kind of converging a little bit on literature and science, kind of naturally just emerged, I guess, over time. And eventually my degrees I ended up getting 3 bachelor's degrees. I spent 6 years in undergrad. I really liked undergrad. So French language and literature was one, microbiology with a minor in chemistry, and then molecular biology. When I was studying French, I really wanted to go study abroad, but I couldn't afford it. So I figured out that if you taught English in France for a year, they would pay you to live there. And I wanted to increase my fluency spoken French. So I took that opportunity. It was really tough. It was really hard teaching French high school kids as an American during the Bush administration and the Iraq War and freedom fries and all that. So that was a challenge, but it was fun. It was the same little town, Voiron, where they make chartreuse, if you are familiar. And then I came back and ended up for my thesis for my French degree. I translated one of my father's books of poems with my French professor, Michel Valentin, pictured here with his cat. And that was my thesis. And we ended up shopping the manuscript over to publishers in France, and it got picked up and published over there. So I was a published author before before I published a scientific publication. And at the end of undergrad, I hadn't really thought about grad school, but I had been washing dishes in the lab of this crotchety old microbiology professor, James Gannon. And he offered me a job in his lab as the lab manager. And I did that for a year and a half, working as his lab manager. And he gave me the kind of freedom to invent a project to do, working with his postdoc, Philip Ramsey. And it ended up being like a biophysics project, my first paper ever. It's in a tiny journal and it doesn't have a lot of citations, but I really loved it, where we grew microbes in a calorimeter and measured the heat output of their growth on a fixed amount of glucose in under varying levels of cadmium exposure, with and without knockouts to cadmium resistance genes, kind of looking at the efficiency of growth of these different knockouts in response to cadmium. That was my, this is my turning point, I would say, my no turning back point for science. I had an offer to go to grad school for French literature, but I decided I was going to double down on science, and I just kind of went with it and never looked back. While I was in Gannon's lab, I wrote a Fulbright application that got funded, and the whole idea was I wanted to do synthetic biology, and in particular, I wanted to solve the energy crisis. So I found this guy, Peter Lindblad, at Uppsala University, Ångström Laboratories, and he was trying to engineer cyanobacteria to produce hydrogen gas as a solution to the energy crisis. So that was my master's degree, essentially. We did get a little bit of hydrogen to be produced from these bugs, but not enough to solve the energy crisis. And I found that I wasn't so interested in this slicing and dicing of plasmids and picking colonies and that kind of work wasn't exciting to me. So I knew that wasn't the kind of science I wanted to do. As an aside, the Nobel Prize there, one of the benefits of being a Fulbright in Sweden is that you get to go to the Nobel Prize ceremony. So I got to go to the 2009 ceremony, and one of the prior Living History speakers, Ramakrishnan, I got to see him receive his prize from the King of Sweden for the structure of the ribosome, which was super cool. So when I was done with that, again, I'm not a big planner. I didn't apply to grad school or anything. I got back to Montana and I was offered a job again, but this was at a weird situation. It was a science ranch in Western Montana where a philanthropist had bought up a big chunk of land and hired a bunch of PhD scientists as essentially PIs to run their own little labs and study the ecology and the restoration of the ecology of this ranch, from microbes up to like grizzly bears. And I worked for this amazing mentor, Ilva Leckberg, who's a fungal ecologist and a soil ecologist. And she was trying to figure out how to use this newfangled technique, which was called pyrosequencing or high throughput sequencing, to study fungal networks in soils and how they affect invasive plant species. And she hired me to essentially help her do that. So I learned those techniques and those tools, and it was a wonderful experience. At the same time, a guy named John McCutcheon was hired at the University of Montana, a microbial genomicist, a great researcher, and I took my first metagenomics course from him, which really set me on the course of microbial ecology and evolution and all that. So now we're going to come to me leaving Montana for good. I haven't been back since, and I took with me a couple of travelers. So still with me today is Oscar the cat, and also my partner Jeff Verlanik. And part of the reason we made our next move, which was to Chicago, was Jeff wanted to go to Second City to be an improv comedian, which he did. He performed on the stage at Second City for a few years before he eventually went to grad school at NYU Tisch for filmmaking. But I spent 5 years here at U Chicago in the biophysics program, and my advisors were Maureen Coleman and Jack Gilbert. And Jake Waldbauer as well was Maureen's husband, who kind of co-ran the lab with her and is a kind of an unofficial mentor. And long story short, my dissertation was essentially kind of using microbial communities as quantitative models for testing and studying ecological theory. And I spent a wonderful summer at the Santa Fe Institute in their complex system summer school while I was there. The next step was a postdoc. I've been reading papers, and I found papers by this guy, Eric Alm at MIT, to be really compelling, especially his environmental microbiology work. I showed up, I interviewed for a job. He said, "We've totally thrown out environmental micro, we're only doing poop now." And I said, okay. And so I came and I studied poop for my postdoc for about 2.5, 3 years. And that was wonderful. And it really got me hooked on the human microbiome and how you can kind of engineer it to solve problems in disease. And that brings us finally, I think I'm over time, to my lab, which is very new. We started just a few years ago. It's a wonderful group of people. We've already done some really fun work. We kind of do stuff all over the map, whether it's computational methods development or modeling or even wet lab experiments. And I like to keep it kind of broad like that. So I don't know what my ultimate, vision is going to be as like what my contribution is, because I don't know what I am yet in a way. And I feel like that will hopefully emerge with time. And I'll end off real quick by giving updates on the important people in my life. My dad was just crowned the poet laureate of Montana this last month, which is kind of crazy. Really, really cool to see him get that honor. My mom's still teaching yoga. My little brother's a wildland forest firefighter now. And so if your house is burning down in California, you might see him on your doorstep, kind of helping you save it. And then Oscar's here with me in Seattle. And Jeff graduated from Tisch, and he's making movies. This is some shots from his latest film, his thesis film, I Await the Devil's Coming, which will be coming soon to festivals near you. And with that, I will end.
Thank you so much, Sean. Wow, what a talk. Thank you. People, do you want to jump in with questions?
Sean, that was super inspiring. Thank you for sharing your story. It's a really unique path that you've gone through and really creative work that you're doing. I'm also super excited about the microbiome because it seems like it gives us so many opportunities for health interventions by food. And what a great way to not be using chemicals or artificial substances. Could you tell us a little bit about what your main goals are?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, exactly. Thank you so much. It's an honor, especially coming from you. That's exactly right. We want to essentially understand the ecological networks and the evolutionary dynamics well enough to be able to engineer these complex systems, or to be able to integrate enough information to be able to predict outputs through this web of interaction. So we do like a lot of flux balance analysis, metabolic modeling kind of stuff, and various other techniques to try to make those predictions. We just had a paper out today where we showed that we could predict weight loss response based on your microbiome. It seems to hinge upon, if your gut is primed for rapid fermentative metabolism, you can more easily lose weight on a high fiber diet. Whereas if your microbes grow more slowly in your gut, but they still have these amylase genes that break down fiber, they're breaking these fibers down, and those sugars are getting absorbed into the host rather before they're transferred into organic acids by the microbes. And so the caloric energy harvest of your food goes up under that particular microbiome composition as opposed to the other. So yeah, there's a lot left to understand, and there's a lot we need to know before we can actually manipulate to predictably get some sort of outcome. But it is an exciting space to be working in for sure.
Thank you. Any other burning questions?
I just asked a quick question. How you find doing science in different languages?
Well, it's a good question. I think I've only really attempted it in French. In Sweden, everyone spoke English. And my Swedish was always so terrible that no one even tried to speak it to me. I did take a class for a few weeks, but I never got that good. It is interesting. I think, when you speak different languages, the way you think is slightly different. The structure of the language can somewhat shape the structure of your thoughts. So I did notice that sort of the form of the way I thought about problems shifted subtly when I would think in French versus think in English.
What sorts of differences did you observe in terms of the forms of your thoughts?
That's really hard to articulate.
Yeah.
But I think with French or with the Latin-based languages, for example, there's slightly more structure to the way one says things, and maybe in sentences are maybe a little more elongated because of that. Whereas English, we take a lot of shortcuts, and there's a lot of non-intuitive jumps sometimes, and in the way we use words or deploy words. And so that might hopefully that answers it somewhat.
Well, more to come in informal discussions. Thank you so much, Sean. So much food for thought in that living history stuff. Everybody, please join me in thanking all three speakers.